Now, we got to think about the chaotic domain for a minute. The chaotic domain is where you don't know what's going to happen. And anything could happen, positive or negative. Anything can happen. And so you can think about the chaotic domain as the birthplace of order. It's the place from which order emerges. Well, it's akin in some sense. Remember what happens in Pinocchio. So Pinocchio goes down into the depths and then into the whale to rescue his father. He goes to the most frightening place possible. And he tests himself against it. And he rescues his father and he brings him up to the surface. But the consequence of that is that he dies. But what dies is the stupid puppet. And so the question is, well, to the degree that you're a stupid puppet, are you willing to let that die? And the answer to that is, it depends on the degree to which you're actually a stupid puppet. Because the more that's true, the more of you has to die. And it's not something trivial. That's why these myths insist upon the horror of the thing that lurks, so to speak, is that that death might be enough to actually kill you if you're not properly prepared for it. And that's what happens to people who are extraordinarily traumatized, for example. It's like huge parts of them are killed, and they often don't recover. So it's no joke. Well, and then of course this is often acted out in the real world too. If, you know, this can happen on a psychological basis. And so your own psychological experiences can be enough to radically disrupt and hurt you. But it can be worked out in the real world too, because if you're wandering around naively with your eyes closed and you run into someone who's really psychopathic, they'll take you apart and you'll have no defense against it whatsoever because you're too blind and naive. And if you encounter someone like that and they leave you in the ashes, which they might, it's certainly possible that you'll never recover from it. You just will not be able to handle the aftermath, but also you won't be able to handle the fact that something like that could actually happen. And that's really the nature of trauma. You cannot believe that that could actually happen. And that's an encounter, it's almost always, and this has been the case, certainly been my clinical experience. What traumatizes people is malevolence. It's not tragedy, although tragedy can traumatize people if it's severe enough. But generally, no, people can withstand tragedy. They are done in by real malevolence. And so sometimes it's the realization of their own malevolence that does them in. But when that isn't the case, they encounter someone who's out there in the world who's actually operating to hurt them. And so, and if the person is psychopathic enough, and this actually goes beyond pure psychopathy, because at least the psychopath has the sense to be self-interested. You can go farther than that, where you're perfectly willing to hurt yourself as long as you hurt the other person at the same time. And that's where you go when you're doing something like conjuring up the idea that you might shoot up a school, because those people always kill themselves at the end. And you might think, well, why don't they just save everyone a lot of trouble and kill themselves at the beginning? Well, that wouldn't exactly be the point, would it? What they want to say is, life means nothing to me, nothing. But I'm perfectly willing to make as many people as I possibly can suffer before I demonstrate that. And so that's a step past psychopathy. And if you encounter that in someone, or in yourself, that's going to be a deeply unsettling experience. And the idea behind many of these stories is that you cannot figure out what to do about that before you have an encounter like that. And if you think about that properly, that's as horrifying an experience as you can imagine, right? It's precisely that. It's as horrifying an experience as you can imagine.